đâu? Hai nhà này còn ai ở không?
Đấy, ngập hết tầng 2 rồi.
Lăn xuống, về bên kia.
Vâng, ơi.
Thôi bế cả con chó nó run tội nó quá. Đã như này nó không cắn đâu.
Không cắn được.
Lên thuyền đi con.
Rồi lên.
Dạ em nước gần ngập đến mái rồi.
3 ngày liền gần như là không ngớt và mọi người
Ơi đừng ngủ nhá, dậy hết đi.
Across northern Vietnam, Typhoon Narra has already killed at least one person, with officials warning that number is likely to climb as flooded and landslide-blocked communities are finally reached and fully assessed. And more than 3,200 customers are still without power tonight in Lang Son province alone, after falling trees and cracked utility poles took down the lines across the province. Highways through the mountains are blocked by landslides. Ports along the northern coast remain closed to all vessels. Schools and health stations in the hardest-hit districts are barely functioning. Here is the important part. The real danger here is not the typhoon's wind speed. It is the fact that the storm has barely moved in 4 days, and forecasters say it could stay parked over the Gulf of Tonkin for several more. Forecasters now describe Narra as one of the slowest moving and most erratic typhoons to threaten northern Vietnam in years, a storm that has wandered south, then east, then back toward the coast instead of following a predictable path out to sea. It took shape over the South China Sea in the days before August 22nd and slowly strengthened into a typhoon, with sustained winds near 55 miles per hour and central pressure hovering around 993 hectopascals, according to Vietnam's National Center for Hydrometeorological Forecasting. Instead of making one clean landfall, the storm stalled just off the coast and spread its rain across an entire stretch of the country, from the coal ports of Quang and the harbor city of Phong, across the rice plains of Bac Ninh, through the river valleys of Lang Son and Cao Bang, all the way south into the farmland of Thanh Hoa. Nearly 3,000 households across 4 provinces were placed under evacuation orders as the storm closed in. Satellite tracking from Japan's Regional Specialized Meteorological Center in Tokyo, the agency that assigned the storm its name, showed its cloud mass barely shifting position over 4 consecutive days, wrapped around a broad, weakening core. A separate flash update from the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance, issued on August 23rd, tracked the same slow-moving weather pattern reaching far beyond Vietnam, into Laos, where more than 7,000 people were evacuated from 17 villages, and into Myanmar, where hundreds of families were moved to flood relief centers. In the hills near Luong Dinh in Quang province, rain totals reached nearly 13 inches in a single stretch, and in Ban Chat, a small community in Lang Son province, rainfall piled up past 12 inches, heavy enough to saturate slopes that had already been soaking for days. On the Luc Nam River, water levels climbed to nearly 21 feet, less than an inch below the province's highest flood alert threshold. And in Lang Son, forecasters say the Quang River could exceed last year's record flood peak by more than 11 feet, turning a river that farmers cross without a second thought into a wall of water bearing down on entire communes. And the storm is not finished. Forecasters say it could sit over these same waters for several more days before it finally begins to break apart. But the true scope of this disaster is not in the rainfall totals. It only becomes clear when you follow the storm hour by hour, from the day it formed to the moment it stalled over the Gulf of Tonkin. In the days before Narra took shape, Vietnamese forecasters already had it on the map. The National Center for Hydrometeorological Forecasting began issuing storm warnings as the system organized over the South China Sea around August 20th, stretching a corridor of alerts from the Gulf of Tonkin toward the mountainous border with China. Provincial authorities suspended fishing boat departures, ordered fleets back to port, and began moving residents out of known landslide zones, aware that a system sitting this close to shore could linger for days instead of passing through in hours. Disaster officials also pulled out an older list, one drawn up long before this storm, naming 31 dike sections between Quang and Tang Hoa already considered vulnerable, along with dozens more river locations and several unfinished dike projects still under construction. Even in those early warnings, forecasters flagged something unusual. Instead of a clean track toward land or out to open water, the storm's projected path swung between south-southwest, southeast, and east-northeast from one update to the next, leaving officials planning for several scenarios at once instead of a single line on a map. Narra first showed its strength on August 22nd when it officially became a typhoon just off the coast of Quang and Haiphong. Wind gusts near 60 miles per hour battered Bok Long V Island, and the first bands of heavy rain began soaking mountain slopes that farmers there had cleared for terraced fields. Quang suspended all vessel permits that morning, stranding nearly 200 tourists, including about 60 foreign visitors, who were moved into shelters on the islands of Ha Long Bay until the seas calmed.
By August 23rd, the storm had barely moved, and the heart of the rain was pounding across Lang Son and Bac Ninh. Trees fell, power poles cracked, and lines came down under the weight of saturated ground, cutting electricity to more than 3,200 customers in Lang Son alone. Rivers that had absorbed days of rain began rising fast. The Luc Nam and Thuong rivers each climbed nearly 2 feet in 8 hours, pushing both toward their highest flood alert levels. Livestock losses climbed too, with more than 6,000 animals and poultry reported dead in Lang Son alone, as floodwater swept through farmyards faster than families could move their herds to higher ground. By that same evening, nearly 7,900 acres of crops across Lang Son, Bac Ninh, and Quang Ninh had gone underwater, most of it rice paddies just weeks from harvest. In Quang Ninh, authorities were still holding nearly 200 stranded tourists on the islands of Ha Long Bay, unable to bring them back to the mainland until wind and waves eased enough for boats to run safely. By this morning, August 24th, the typhoon's center was still parked over the northern Gulf of Tonkin, roughly 87 miles east of Quang Ninh, and crawling southeast at barely 2 miles per hour. Local reports from Lang Son describe schools, health stations, and market buildings damaged by the flooding, while more than 600 landslide and flood points have cut roads across the province at various times since the rain began. Provincial officials say some of those roads have been cleared and reopened more than once, only to be blocked again by fresh slides hours later. When you look at the toll from Typhoon Narra, the numbers do not line up neatly. Different agencies are counting on different timelines, and in a storm that has not finished moving, that gap is wider than usual. Vietnam's Disaster and Dike Management Authority puts the confirmed death toll at 1, a resident killed when a landslide struck his home in Lang Son Province. A regional flash update from the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance, compiled a few hours earlier, cites the same single confirmed death, but a lower count of damaged housing. A reminder that even basic numbers shift by the hour in a disaster this fluid. Local station reports in Lang Son describe housing damage climbing from under 1,000 homes on Saturday to more than 2,700 by Sunday evening as floodwater kept rising. Behind that single confirmed death is a mechanism officials in Vietnam's mountainous north see again and again. Landslides here rarely strike without warning signs, but the warning window is short, and it often comes at night when saturated slopes let go without anyone watching. In Lang Son, the one death recorded so far came exactly that way, a hillside collapsing onto a home in Tai Binh Commune during heavy rain. Emergency officials are now warning of several other mechanisms that could add to that toll if the rain continues. Electrocution from downed power lines lying in floodwater, drowning at river crossings that look shallow but carry a current strong enough to sweep away a motorbike, traffic accidents on mountain roads where a landslide has narrowed a lane or left loose rock across the pavement. And a slower risk that rarely makes headlines: families returning to flood-damaged homes before officials confirm it is safe, only to be caught by a second slide once the ground gives way again. Local rescue teams say the geography of Langsan makes every one of those risks harder to manage. Villages sit in narrow valleys with a single road in and out, so a landslide in one spot can trap a community for hours before help arrives. Officials are unanimous on one point. A death toll of 1 does not mean this storm has been mild. It means the worst of it, in a system that has barely moved in 4 days, may still be ahead. Inside Vietnam's northern rice belt, another quieter emergency is building. The same storm that cut power and blocked mountain roads also flooded nearly 20,000 acres of rice and other crops, most of it in Langsan and Bac Ninh, just weeks before the region's main harvest. Vietnam is one of the world's largest rice exporters, and losses concentrated in a single narrow window before harvest do not simply vanish once the water recedes. For farming households who had already committed a full season of labor and borrowed money for seed and fertilizer, it is a statistic with very real consequences behind it.
Regional agriculture officials say the full scale of the crop loss will not be clear until floodwater drops enough to assess fields still underwater. Combined with the livestock already lost to the flooding, many rural households in Langsan are now facing the loss of both their harvest and their savings in the same season. For a farming family in that position, the storm does not end when the rain stops. It ends months later when the next planting cycle either happens on schedule or does not. Even as the rain begins to ease in some areas, the danger from Narra has not passed. More than 3,200 customers are still without power tonight, most of them in Langsan province, where downed lines remain tangled in flood debris. Rising river levels have left some communes cut off for days, and provincial officials are warning that with more than 600 landslide points already recorded since the storm began, full road access could take several more days to restore. Here is the important part. While these communities are still coping with flooding and landslides, the storm itself is refusing to leave. Vietnam's national forecasters say Narra could linger over the northern Gulf of Tonkin through Tuesday before finally curving northeast and weakening into a tropical depression over southern China, meaning the rain that has already pushed rivers toward record levels is not guaranteed to stop tonight. Slopes across Langsan and Quang are still carrying days of rain they have not had time to shed. Roads are weakened, and dozens of dike sections identified as vulnerable even before this storm are now under close watch. A second round of heavy rain on top of that could trigger new landslides, fresh flooding, and another round of evacuations, just as families are trying to return to homes only recently declared safe. For mountain communes that depend on a single access road, a new landslide can cut off not just travel, but fuel, food, and the medical transport that rural clinics rely on. Across the provinces hit hardest by Narra, the response effort is now stretching into its 4th day. Power crews in Langsan have restored service to some neighborhoods, but more utility reports show more than 3,000 customers still without power as of Sunday evening, most of them in areas where roads remain too damaged for repair trucks to reach quickly. On the ground, provincial transport departments are clearing more than 600 landslide and flood points recorded since the storm began, prioritizing National Highway 4B, a key route through Langsan's mountains that has been blocked in multiple sections. Quang Ninh's Maritime Authority has kept its C-ban in place since 7 in the morning on August 22nd, halting all vessel traffic, including the tour boats that carry visitors through Ha Long Bay, until forecasters confirm the storm has moved far enough offshore. School officials in several Langsan communes have delayed the start of the term because floodwater has not fully receded from classrooms and access roads remain impassable for school buses. Health workers in the same province are also stretched thin, running mobile clinics out of trucks in communes where the local health station itself was among the buildings damaged by the storm. Vietnam's prime minister has directed provincial governments to keep evacuation orders in place for high-risk areas and to prioritize search and rescue in communities still cut off by landslides, while the Disaster and Dike Management Authority continues compiling damage reports from all 4 affected provinces. Emergency managers say the next few days will be critical as they try to restore power, reopen roads, and move families back home safely before the rainy season's next system develops. In the days ahead, Narra is likely to be remembered less for its wind speed and more for its refusal to move. Vietnamese forecasters are already describing it as one of the most erratic storms to affect the northern coast in years, not because of its strength, but because of how long it parked over the same stretch of water while changing direction again and again. It exposed weak points officials have flagged for years. Dike systems along the coast from Quang to Thang Hoa that regulators had already listed among dozens of vulnerable sites before this storm even formed. Mountain roads in Lang Son and Cao Bang that turn into single points of failure the moment one slope gives way, and rural power grids that cannot easily reroute electricity once a handful of poles go down in a remote commune. Here is the important part. It is not only the mountain communes that ended up exposed. Coastal towns built around tourism and fishing are absorbing their own version of this storm, one measured not in landslides but in lost income as boats stay tied up and visitors stay away for as long as the sea ban remains in effect. At the same time, scientists and climate researchers are careful with their language. No single typhoon can be blamed entirely on climate change, but Narra fits into a pattern that experts across the region say is becoming more familiar. A warmer ocean surface can feed more moisture into a storm, and weaker steering winds can leave that storm parked in place for days instead of moving through in hours. That combination means the same category of storm can now sit over one province and drop the kind of rainfall that used to take an entire season to accumulate. Narra is also prompting questions in Hanoi about investment. How much should be spent reinforcing the dike sections already flagged as vulnerable before the next storm tests them? How to widen or reroute mountain highways that leave entire communes isolated when a single stretch collapses? How to build warning systems that tell rural families not just that a storm is coming, but how many days of rain to actually prepare for? And just as important, how to support farming households and small landholders who have the fewest resources to absorb a lost harvest. In the end, the story of Typhoon Narra is not really about wind speed or a storm category. It's a reminder of how much damage a storm can do simply by refusing to leave, when saturated ground, aging infrastructure, and days of rain all collide. A single system that never even made a clean landfall still managed to flood nearly 20,000 acres of cropland, cut power to thousands of homes, force nearly 3,000 households from their communities, and leave at least one family grieving a loss that officials say could still grow. For the communities of Lang Son and Quang, Narra will likely be remembered not as a wind speed on a forecast map, but as the week the rivers would not stop rising. For people in the storm's path, the message from officials is simple. Watch official forecasts, not just wind speed, but how long a storm is expected to sit in place. Have a plan for what to do if a slope near your home shows new cracks or your local river crosses its alert level. Check on elderly neighbors and anyone without reliable transportation out of a flood zone. And as recovery begins in the hardest-hit communes, the choices officials make about dikes, roads, and warning systems will decide how ready these same communities are the next time a typhoon decides not to move on. If you have family or friends in northern Vietnam right now, what are they telling you about how this storm compares to ones they've lived through before?